ran across this the other day that John Brown later, he lived in New York for a while. He was a famous abolitionist. There was a maybe it was like 500 acres or so up in the Adirondacks of New York. The place was called
what?
The Adirondack Mountains.
Okay.
It was called Timbuktu, and it was set up as kind of a demonstration where African Americans, freed, and some of them were actually runaways, that would go there and set up this whole town and community and this whole environment of African Americans and show America and the world that African Americans were equal. And so this experiment called Timbuktu in upstate New York was one of those kind of places that kind of is like this colonization, this segregated, separate place for freed slaves.
And John Brown, you said this was John Brown's.
Yeah. Well, he was associated with it. He didn't set it up, but he was kind of a gadfly abolitionist. He roamed all over the country, all the Midwest, New York,
John Brown.
Kansas.
Just a little background on John Brown.
Yeah.
John Brown was a white abolitionist.
Yes.
He was an abolitionist, but he also was incredibly militant. He believed that it was God's calling for him to. He killed pro-slavery forces in Kansas. Yes. And raided a federal armory.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes. Kansas was a problem because the Congress, in its infinite wisdom, decided that Kansas could decide when it was going to become a state whether it wanted to be a free state or a slave state. Hmm. Well, automatically that creates two groups of people in Kansas that want their agenda, and so and it became Bleeding Kansas. Literally, there's a civil war in Kansas before the real Civil War about slavery, pro-slavery forces in Kansas and anti-slavery. So John Brown goes to Kansas to support the anti-slavery movement in Kansas and is involved in a couple of massacres of pro-slavery people, hacked about half a dozen or so in a ditch. And just all kinds of. He's definitely. You're right. He's a radical abolitionist who feels very comfortable with the use of force. In that regard, he's kind of like Nat Turner, who preceded John Brown by maybe 20 years. But
he also believed that he had visions. Even as a kid and growing up, he believed he had visions.
Sure.
That he was, he believed God was telling him that he needed to revolt and kill his masters.
Yeah, there are some similarities between John Brown later and earlier Nat Turner. They both were very religious. John Brown could quote major portions of the Old Testament.
An interesting thing.
So the use of religion and the use of religion for a liberation is key to both John Brown as well as Nat Turner. Yes. Nat Turner's an African American slave.
There's a stark difference. One of them is white from
New York originally.
New York,
yeah. And he floated around
somewhere up north. And he was well off, wasn't he?
No, he never really had much to his name. He floated around the country a lot of times trying to raise money for abolitionist causes. So he was kind of a drifter that kind of glommed on to the abolitionist movement and just really became famous for this raid on a federal arsenal. And he was going to take those weapons and go into Virginia and arm the slaves to liberate themselves in Virginia. And the raid on Harper's Ferry goes bad.
And one interesting thing is after John Brown was caught, after the raid on the federal armory to try to arm slaves, he said he always, even after he was caught, he said he always followed the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it's interesting. He chopped up pro-slave. He was a brutal. He went around killing people. And
there are similarities.
It was an interesting thing I came across, and I was like, oh,
well,
this guy really believed in what he definitely believed in what he was doing.
His last speech before they took him out and hung him, I've got excerpts here. Had I interfered on behalf of the rich and the powerful and the intelligent, no one would have. It would have been all right, but every man in this court would have deemed it an act of.
Can you start that over?
If I had interfered, John Brown, if I had interfered on behalf of the rich and the powerful, it would have been all right. but he goes on to say that I've interfered on behalf of the powerless.
Meaning,
and so what he's basically saying is this country wants a second class status for and wants slavery. And I believe that the Bible teaches that all men are, that God is no respecter. He references God is no respecter of persons.
Yeah.
And there's that principle of equality again, I think, with a biblical gloss onto it. So his last speech is a remark. I would encourage your listeners maybe to look up John Brown's last speech before he was hung. There's really some interesting things in there.
Look up John Brown alone, but that speech as well.
And and there are some contradictions.
I mean, look up David Walker.
Oh, yeah.
Look up Nat Turner.
Yeah, Turner's interesting. He's one of those.
And I want to get to this real quick here too. One thing I was thinking while I was going through some of the stuff.
You and that mic stand.
Dude, just leave it. Is it really? All right. I did it again. Okay.
What'd you do?
I'm messing with the mic.
Okay.
Maybe it's just like a nervous
thing,
tick. It's a nervous, move it around so it sounds nicer.
I didn't mean to interject. I'm sorry.
You couldn't help it. It's okay, man. I appreciate the sound advice. Okay. One thing I was thinking about was Nat Turner and John Brown. I mean, would these people be considered? I mean, in history, you look at it, they're heroic in a way. I mean, a lot of the things they did was awful. They were
very divisive.
Very divisive, but I mean, they're on the right side of history in the end. My question is this.
Let me pose you this, though. I mean,
let me just throw this out. Heroes or terrorists? Or both?
Well, most people said, look, we agree with John's viewpoint. We just don't agree the way in which he went about it. And I think even today I see some modern parallels. Like there are some folks within the anti-abortion movement that are pretty radicalized, and those folks that are in the anti-abortion movement would say, look, I don't think, I'm opposed to abortion, but I'm not in favor of shooting abortion doctors on their way out the door when they go home to work. So I think there's some interesting parallels between some of the more radical anti-abortion folks. And I was in the helm of one person years ago who had a picture. He was a radical anti-abortion person. He had a picture of John Brown in his living room. It was his hero.
No kidding.
He saw a real
anti-abortion.
Yeah. Activist. Well, the point being that we've had this horrific. I mean, in his mind, we've had this horrific system called abortion in this country, and we've tried to use the system to change the system, and it is not. So now it's appropriate to use violence.
Measures.
Yeah, and so John Brown that was his argument. We've tried to legislate slavery out, but it keeps moving west into new territories and the new states. Now is the time where that violence may be appropriate. So I think there's some interesting parallels there between John Brown's approach to anti-slavery and maybe some of the more radical groups associated with the anti-abortion movement.